There's seats down here in front, if one wants it. Good evening. I'm Bertram Ashe, professor of English in the University of Richmond English Department. And I'd like to welcome you to the latest talk in the University of Richmond English Department's Writer Series. David Shields teaches in the English Department at the University of Washington and has published a total of 10 books, including The Thing About Life Is That One Day You'll Be Dead, a New York Times bestseller, Black Planet, Facing Race During an NBA Season, a finalist for the National Book Critics Circles Award, Remote, Reflections on Life in the Shadow of Celebrity, winner of the PEN Revson Award, and Dead Languages, a novel, winner of the PEN Syndicated Fiction Award. What I find most amazing about Reality Hunger, David Shields' new book, is its narrative cohesion. In much the same way that he did in Black Planet and more recently in The Thing About Life Is That One Day You'll Be Dead, is that Shields somehow crafts extremely compelling, completely absorbing reading experiences out of snippets of reference material, anecdotes, stray quotations, short overheard conversations, and other seemingly extraneous gestures. I couldn't stop reading Black Planet or The Thing About Life or Reality Hunger until the final page. And I really had no choice in the matter. David's books have the peculiar effect of forcing me, anyway, to carry them around with me all the time. David Shields' books tempt me at red lights, demanding to be read even though I know green is only seconds away. And for a period of time, even after finishing these books, I find myself still carrying them around as if the books, as material objects, are as valuable as the ideas inside. In his new book, Reality Hunger, a Manifesto, David Shields takes a long, ecstatic look at nonfiction, but not just any nonfiction. He's championing reality-based art to the extent that he's written a supporting manifesto. And a major theme of Reality Hunger is appropriation and plagiarism and what those terms mean. David Shields argues that an essential part of Reality Hunger is that reality cannot be copyrighted. He says, among other things, quote, life doesn't have narrative lines. Reality-based art, unprocessed, uncut, underproduced, splinters and explodes. The novel is dead. Long live the anti-novel built from scraps. I love this book. I fought with this book. Some of the ideas are so close to how I feel that I could have written the book myself. And yet, as someone who loves the novel, some of Reality Hunger's claims completely oppose how I feel. It's a book that delighted me. It's a book that challenged me. It's a book that infuriated me. It's a book that provoked me. Many books are called important. David Shields has written a book that actually is important, and we're delighted to have him with us tonight. Please help me welcome David Shields.
Thank you, Bert, for those very... Do you hear me back there fine? Is that carrying well? Thanks, Bert, for those thoughtful and generous comments. I think I'll read for, or actually I'll talk about the book for about 30 or 40 minutes, and then I'll welcome your questions. It's very much a book meant to provoke and to incite, I suppose. And so please feel free to ask questions afterward, challenge me, question me, etc. So the first thing I wanted to bring up is this thing I usually start with, which is that when I give a formal talk, I often stutter a bit. I grew up with a fairly bad stutter as a kid, and I still stutter a bit sometimes. And so rather than have that be the elephant in the room that no one's talking about, I sort of like to just get it out there and say it so it's not this weird shadow in the room. So anyway, that's something I'd like to begin with. And it's also oddly relevant to this book in the sense that when I was a kid, I was sort of like this little 6-year-old Derridian deconstructionist who had a very bad stutter. And because I stuttered as a kid, I was very aware of the self-reflexive nature of language as a sort of reverb of effect, of the ways in which a language is always recursing and always reinscribing itself. And then I also grew up with two journalist parents. I grew up in LA and San Francisco, and both of my parents were, as I say, journalists, and there was a sense that they believed in this sort of transcribable reality and transparent language that would convey the real, that I very much grew up in the realm of the real. And there was a wonderful line by Walt Whitman that could have been inscribed on our welcome mat, which was, "The true poem is the daily paper." You know, that was sort of our working definition. And I feel like in many ways this book of mine, Reality, Hunger, and Manifesto, is a weird collision of my parents' view of language and reality, which is a sort of journalist view, and in a way a stutterer's view of language and reality, which is that we can never quite get there, that the language is always this sort of self-canceling, self-reflexive substance. I think what those two things produce in me is a sense of, one of the big arguments of the book is that nonfiction isn't true. Nonfiction is a framing device to foreground contemplation. Memory itself is a dream machine. The moment that we compose, we're inventing. And it's, to me, crucial to go back into the history of nonfiction and see that this has always been thus. Some of you guys probably are familiar with the recent, or relatively recent sort of scandals involving, James Fry making stuff up in his memoir. But really, it goes back to the very beginnings of nonfiction. One of the founding documents, practically, of Western civilization is Thucydides' book, The History of the Peloponnesian Wars. And in that book, Thucydides makes up the general's speeches. To me, that's just a very telling fact, or fact, I guess, that this book that we worship as one of the first books of Western history, that is one of the first books of Western literature, ostensibly a work of nonfiction, the author of that book has invented the general's speeches. So too in another famous work, Thomas de Quincey's Confessions of an English Opium Eater is a virtually fictional account of de Quincey's addiction to and recovery from opium, and yet that book is understood to be a classical work of British autobiography. So too Edmund Goss's book called Father and Son, that was it's a book written when Goss was 57. It's full of long dialogues between father and son when the boy was 8. It was written 45 or 50 years after the supposed events, but there's all this sort of supposedly verbatim dialogue between father and son. And that book, too, was also questioned by all of the Goss relatives and friends and family. And one last example, George Orwell's classical essay, Such Were the Joys, a great account of his brutal experience at a British boarding school. That book, that essay too, almost all of Orwell's classmates questioned virtually every detail of that essay. So I guess the thing I'm trying to argue is that nonfiction has been a vexed thing from the very beginning. That nonfiction in a way has its own stutter, you might say, its own weird limbo land between fiction and nonfiction, and that we kind of are childlike, or almost worse, perhaps lawyerly, when we try to think of nonfiction as this absolutely true thing, this absolutely transparently, provably true thing. Whereas I think if we're honest about ourselves, that we know, as I say, that memory is a kind of dream machine. The moment that we compose, we make stuff up. There's a line in my book in which I say, I can't write a note to my daughter's 11th grade humanities teacher without little lies leaking in, or something like that. You know, I think that may just be me and my pathological liarness, but I think that there's something that we know about language, about memory, about knowledge, that it's not absolute. And part of one of the big arguments of the book is to try to argue for a much more sophisticated notion of nonfiction. Try and rescue nonfiction as art. Yes, there is nonfiction as scholarship, there's nonfiction as journalism, but I want to say there's also this ancient and glorious tradition going from, say, from Thucydides to, say, you know, Joan Didion, that is nonfiction as art. And I want us to think about it in a much more sophisticated way. I thought I'd tell you a little bit about how I got to this point. You know, as I say, both of my parents were journalists. I grew up very much sort of worshiping the written word and worshiping nonfiction. And so my big rebellion was to become not a writer of nonfiction, but a writer of fiction. This was my sort of massive Oedipal, you know, a rebellion was to become a slightly different writer than my parents were. And so the first 3 books I wrote were works of fiction, 3 novels, a book called Heroes, a book called Dead Languages, which Bert mentioned, and a 3rd book, a novel and stories called Handbook for Drowning. And I was very much invested in the idea of myself as a fiction writer, as I say, as a kind of mini rebellion against my parents' nonfiction. And to me, it was a terribly interesting moment in my writing life about a dozen years ago. I was working on what I thought was my 4th novel, a book called Remote. And that's a book that became this book called Remote, Reflections on Life in the Shadow of Celebrity. And I found, to my surprise and perhaps horror, that I just could not get the novelistic machinery to operate. All of the usual gestures that a fiction writer makes, such as creating a plot, creating characters, creating a setting, creating backstory, creating scenes, I just found myself sort of almost literally unable to do. And by all accounts, these things are apparently pretty important to novels, plots and characters and scenes. And I think what I found with that book, it's sort of what I call my Alice down the rabbit hole moment, where I just sort of lost touch with the novel and have never quite come back to it, is that that book is very much a staging of my deep ambivalence. It's one I think that we all share, or perhaps many of us share. A deep ambivalence, a sort of love-hate relationship with mass culture. I was sort of both addicted to mass culture, pop culture, and also terribly repelled by it. And that book is my attempt to explore that in 52 interlinked meditations. And what I found in that book, and what I continue to find as myself as a writer and reader and teacher, is that I'm much more interested in writing a book that explores the war between myself, you know, between my various selves, rather than expressing that those feelings through a series of surrogate fictional selves. I'm terribly interested in myself as a sort of theme carrier, or as a sort of symbolic persona. And perhaps I'll read a couple of lines that I find terribly important along this line. Philip Lopate says that you are not important except insofar as an example that can serve to elucidate a more widespread human trait and thereby make readers feel less lonely and less freakish. And so too, William Butler Yeats says, it must go further still. That soul must become its own betrayer, its own deliverer, the one activity, the mirror turn lamp. And I guess that what I'm trying to say is that I'm really interested in work that is what I call, it's about what it's about. That it's you know, like, let's say you want to write a book about your sort of furious love-hate affair with mass culture. I seem to want books that actually overtly wrestle with that, paragraph by paragraph, line by line, page by page, rather than constructing a sort of fictional narrative that sort of gives lip service to exploring that idea, but really isn't investigating it line by line. One other preface I thought I'd mention how I came to write this odd book is I was hired, I teach at the University of Washington in Seattle. I was hired there almost 20 years ago. I was hired as a fiction writer, and I felt after a while as if I were taking money under slightly false pretenses, because as my interest evolved away from fiction and toward nonfiction, I felt like I had to justify what I was actually interested in. So I developed this course, a graduate course on self-reflexive essay and on the self-reflexive documentary film. And the course pack for this course was this huge blue unwieldy binder full of literally thousands of quotations that I gathered over many years that were sort of my sort of life raft. They were sort of my favorite quotes, stuff I'd written, stuff other people had written, stuff I was actively newly writing, stuff said by, you know, ancient writers, stuff said by contemporary writers, all arguing for the excitement of the non-fictional gesture. And year by year, this course packet got less it had less typographical errors in it, it had less repetition. The quotes went from thousands of quotes to perhaps hundreds of quotes. And then the big break for me was realizing I could start shoving these quotes into categories, so that the passages about, say, memory all started to hang together. The passages about hip-hop started to hang together. The passages about risk and doubt and et cetera all started to hang together. And so the book began as a very organic process and stayed a relatively organic process, by which there's a lot of sort of controversy about the book now because it's built out of all of these quotations. But in reality, it kind of began as this actual course pack, and the arguments developed from me taking various people's quotations and then remixing them. So there is hope for us writer professors who can actually take course packets and make of them possible books. So what is the book? I mean, I've given you a lot of preface and background. What is the book? I think the book, I mean, Bert described it well, and I'm not sure I can improve on that greatly, but the book is sort of a call to arms to my fellow writers and creative artists to obliterate distinctions between fiction and nonfiction, to overturn laws regarding appropriation, and develop new forms for a new century. That's sort of the core of the book. The argument is that we live in this unbelievably simulated, artificial, and mediated world. And as human animals, that we have a deep need for reality that's not being met by old and crumbling forms of literature. One of the arguments of the book is that that from the beginning of time, writers have rated other writers. That, for instance, Shakespeare's Henry VI, 2/3 of that play is essentially lifted from Plutarch's Lives. What other examples do I have for you? I mean, James Joyce said, "I'm quite content to go down to posterity as a scissors and paste man." Certainly in the visual arts, Andy Warhol, Richard Prince, certainly in contemporary music, and certainly the appropriation experiments of people like Kathy Acker and William S. Burroughs. So much of what I'm trying to do is to reclaim for ourselves the writerly freedoms that writers have had from the beginning of time. And what I'm trying to argue is that in contemporary digital culture, that we need to be free to be able to pull from other text as much as previous writers pulled from other writers. The three epigraphs of the book might give you a bit of a handrail on the book. The first epigraph is from the German writer Walter Benjamin, who says, every great work of literature either dissolves a genre or invents one. That's sort of the biggest argument of the book that I'm making, that I'm trying to argue the most exciting work, in my view, is neither a conventional memoir that follows a relatively predictable path, or, to me, the relatively mainstream novel, which also is following a relatively predictable path, but specifically works that blur and defy genre. I'm trying to argue is the most exciting work. A good example of it for me is, I don't know if any of you know a film by Ross McElwee called Sherman's March. Is that a film any of you have seen or perhaps studied in classes? It's an extraordinary work. Do you know it? To me, it's a wonderful example of what I'm trying to get to, which is, it's very hard to locate that film. On the one hand, that film is a biographical portrait of General Sherman. On the other hand, it's a film very much about McElwee's ambivalence about the North and South. McElwee was born in North Carolina, moved to Massachusetts, and seems obsessed with the difference between the North and South. Third of all, the film is about McElwee's complicated relationship to various women in the South whom he's courting. Fourth of all, it's very much about a filmmaker and his relationship as a cameraman to the subjects that he's filming, and the way in which a camera can often colonize the space that it's filming. And it's also very much, believe it or not, about the rise of nuclear weapons during the Reagan administration. And what makes that film so exciting for me is that you never know exactly where you are. Are we in a documentary space? Are we in a confessional space? Is it an anthropological film? Is it a critique about Ross McElwee's love life? And the thing that's so exciting about the film is that he gets you to see the connections between private experience and public experience, between a political argument and an artistic argument. And to me, that creates a much more exciting artistic work than a work that is following a very pro forma direction, as for instance, take an extreme example like a romantic comedy whose contours are extremely well established before you watch it. So the strongest argument that the book is making is to argue for the excitement of genre-defying works. The second epigraph of the book is from Picasso, who says, "Art is theft." And the way I'm trying to use that is that throughout the book, I'm quoting a lot of different sources, as I've said. Some of the writing is from me, some of the writing is from other people, and some of the writing, I've taken what other people have written and have, you might say, scratched on it or remixed it, remade it. And I had a long, drawn-out argument with the publisher about this, as you might have suspected, that I argued long and hard. I consulted many copyright lawyers, and I wrote numerous memos to the publisher about it. And they finally said, you know, you can argue till you're blue in the face, we're not going to publish the book without citations. And so the compromise solution that we wound up with is the book has citations in the back of the book, but they're in very small type, and many of the citations are rather cryptic or even slightly misleading, in which I say, well, I couldn't quite find that quotation. And I also preface the appendix with a disclaimer in which I say, please, for the love of God, don't read these citations. Stop, read no farther. If you want to read the book the way I want it to be read, take out a box cutters and cut along the vertical dotted line that marks the last 10 pages of the book. And why am I doing this? Why am I going through so many cartwheels regarding the citations? Because just as I'm arguing for that the most exciting work resists genre, in precisely the same way, I want to argue for what a friend of mine calls the dubiety of the first person pronoun. Just like I want you to experience on a theoretical level that the most exciting work you can't quite locate, so too I want you to feel, well, who is the speaker? Is it Shields? Is it Sonny Rollins? Is it Schopenhauer? Is it some strange mix of all of them? Is it none of them? Is it all of them? And so the third epigraph of the book is from Graham Greene, who says, when we are not sure we are alive. And that, to me, gathers the first argument about genre, the second argument about appropriation, and gathers it into this one final statement. Basically, the whole book is an ode to uncertainty, to doubt. To me, the best work plunges the reader into a kind of vertiginous doubt, into existential doubt. And this book both argues for it and tries to actually practice it at the same time. A lot of what I'm doing, I feel like, there was a term that Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan used 20 years ago. Forget exactly what he was describing, but he said, perhaps some of you, perhaps Andrea will know as a political scientist, but he was describing, he said, defining deviance downward. I forget exactly what he was describing. It's not exactly relevant. But I want to sort of kidnap that phrase because I want to, a lot of what I find in the contemporary discussion of nonfiction defines nonfiction downward. Basically, a huge amount of nonfiction is viewed as a subset of journalism, that everything gets vetted. James Fry, Charles Pellegrino, John DeGatta, Gerald Posner. Seems like virtually every week, you remember the whole confusion about Shepard Fairey's Obama's Hope poster, the controversy regarding a Robert Capa photograph that was a staged photograph of a soldier falling. I mean, virtually weekly, there's a confusion about what's real and what's not. And a huge amount of the contemporary discussion, I would say, defines nonfiction downward. It views it as a kind of, I don't know what, that we view it in a very childlike way, like, well, is it literally true? Were you wearing a purple sweater then or a magenta sweater then? Let's look at the photographs. Whereas what I want to do is what I call define nonfiction upward. That I want to take the very terms that nonfiction is supposedly based on and rotate them 180 degrees and use the supposed premises of nonfiction to make of nonfiction an incredibly interesting philosophical form. That is to say, if you take the grounds on which nonfiction is supposed to stand, truth, facts, and reality, and rotate those terms upward, you wind up with a deeply philosophical, deeply meditative, epistemologically sophisticated work. That is to say, the works of nonfiction I want to champion, the works I'm trying to write and read and teach, the way I'm trying to push the culture and thinking about work, is that, to me, the best nonfiction, like, say, the Ross McElwee film, used nonfiction as a framing device to ask questions like, what's true? What's knowledge? What's memory? What's reality? What's a self? How much can a self know about the other? Do you see what I mean? That if you define nonfiction downward, it becomes this very pedestrian, very mundane, very, I don't know what, fact-based thing. If you rotate it upwards, you use its ostensible non-fictionality as a wonderful launching pad, or what do you call it, like a trampoline off which to bounce into asking these incredibly rich philosophical questions. And that's really a huge part of my strategy as a writer and reader and teacher and, I guess, manifesto writer. Part of the reason I'm interested in these sort of, in all this stuff, is that one of the titles that Bert mentioned was a book of mine that came out a couple of years ago called The Thing About Life Is That One Day You'll Be Dead. And I guess, I don't know what it is. More than most people, I suppose, I'm very aware that we're mortal. I'm perfectly healthy, thanks. I think I'm fine. You know, I've got some backaches, but that's about it. But I'm not a religious person. I don't have access to any religious faith. And so I'm terribly aware of mortality as a fact of human life. And for me, in that fact, writing is unbelievably important. That is to say, I think we are existentially alone on the planet. That is, I can't know what you're thinking and feeling, and you can't know what I'm thinking and feeling. And writing at its very best is a bridge that we construct across that abyss of human loneliness. And to me, writing is an unbelievably serious project. It actually connects human beings as well, perhaps better than any other human activity, because in my view, the best work does nothing less than show how the writer solved being alive. That's a pretty high charge, but it shows you that in the very best work, there's actually this sort of assuaging of loneliness between people. I think a good example of it is a book that I keep on championing. You would think that she might be my cousin or something, as much as I talk about this book, but I don't know her. But it's a book that I just love called Bluets by Maggie Nelson. It's sort of a perfect example of what I'm talking about. It's just a short book published by a small press, and believe it or not, ostensibly it's just a meditation on the color blue. It doesn't sound too promising. And then the meditation on the color blue becomes a meditation on Maggie Nelson being unable to get over the loss she feels over this love affair coming to an end. And then the bottom drops out even farther, and the book is very much about her friend who, as a result of a car accident, is now a quadriplegic. And the book keeps on getting larger and larger and larger, and deeper and deeper and deeper, and sadder and sadder and sadder. And you come to realize the book is about nothing less than something like the melancholy of the human animal. How do we live with loss? How do we live with the ultimate loss of the fact that we die? And so the books that I love the most, the kinds of books that Reality Hunger is trying to champion, seem to try to have as thin a membrane as possible between the writer and reader. They seem to try to get to something unbelievably real between writer and reader. They take extraordinarily seriously this conversation between writer and reader, and don't settle for what I call the entertainment. Like that, there's a wonderful line by Cynthia Ozick who says, "I don't find entertainment infotainment entertaining, and that the kinds of work I seem to love the most, the kinds of books that I'm championing, are works of investigation. Samuel Johnson said, a work of literature should either show us how to endure existence, a work of literature should help us to enjoy existence, or should teach us how to endure existence. And the books that I seem to love a lot, the books that Reality Hunger is championing, seem to be more of the latter. They're actually showing you how to endure existence. They're actually showing you how the writer solved being alive. One of the ways that they do this is, for me, through literary collage. That many of the books that I'm talking about, the films like, say, Maggie Nelson's Bluets, Ross McElwee's Sherman's March, Amy Fusselman's The Pharmacist's Mate, Sarah Manguso's The Two Kinds of Decay, Spalding Gray's Morning, Noon, and Night, Simon Gray's The Smoking Diaries, or various books. Instead of putting as the energy of the work the narrative machinery of what happens next, the work feels collage-like to me. The writer goes wherever he or she wants to go, sometimes into fiction, sometimes into reportage, sometimes into diary, sometimes into political polemic. The writer goes wherever he or she wants to go to get deeper into their topic. And the effect of that for me is that the reader isn't reading just to turn pages. The reader is reading to find out how all the material comes together. And that, for me, is a more exciting readerly experience than simply reading for plot. I realize I'm probably in the minority. Probably a lot of you are saying, well, what's the matter with plot? I'm just trying to create an alternative version. You know, obviously, the mainstream novel, the mainstream Hollywood movie, the mainstream memoir still have most of the attention of the populace. I'm just trying to say there is this alternative tradition, this exciting counter tradition that goes back millennia, and it has great potentials for creative expression. I'll make a couple last points, and then I'll be happy to see how we are doing on time, and then I'll be happy to take your questions. One thing that I really seem to be arguing for is the virtue of speed, the virtue of concision, compression, velocity. That, you know, part of my weariness and exhaustion and boredom with the contemporary novel is the incredibly glacial pace at which most mainstream novels happen. That we live in this unbelievably fast-paced culture. We live in this, you know, digitally based culture, that we live extremely, you know, sort of speedy lives, both online and offline. And it seems to me just preposterous how much that we accept and tolerate kind of these glacially paced novels. They seem to be essentially escapes from contemporary culture rather than investigations of contemporary existence. And so one of the things that I'm trying, the works that I seem to love, I hope that an example of it is my own book, is works that have some of the compression and concision, the velocity and speed of contemporary culture. That I feel like that art, like science, moves forward. Art progresses. And as much as I admire the great works of the past, like, say, you know, Madame Bovary, that we shouldn't continue to use that as a model, that all great works of literature broke from the past, that Virginia Woolf is a great writer because she broke from what she was reading. And the reason that we read Virginia Woolf now is because she pushed the novel and literature forward. And so many of the works that we now hold up as admirable works of contemporary literature are, in my view, simply repeating the literary discoveries and formal movements of really the mid-20th century. There's a wonderful line by Friedrich Nietzsche who said, "My ambition is to say in 10 sentences what everyone else says in a whole book, or rather what everyone else does not say in a whole book." That, you know, that there's a wonderful fact that when we write concisely and in a compressed way, that it sort of pushes us toward greater candor, toward rawer nerves, toward more sort of discomforting thoughts. It's kind of like the line that, you know, I didn't have time to write a short letter, so I wrote a long letter. You know, it's harder to write short, it's harder to write brief, because there's nowhere to hide. If you write, say, a paragraph letter to someone, you know, as if you write a 10-page letter, you can sort of hide amidst all the morass of words. But if you write a postcard and it's not a very fully felt or carefully considered postcard, you're exposed, I think. And lastly, I just want to talk a little bit about boredom. There's a wonderful line of Kafka's that probably gets quoted too much, probably quoted too much by me as well. This whole idea of, you know, a book should be an axe to break the frozen sea within us. I mean, that's maybe a little bit melodramatic or a little corny, but I really love that line, and I take it quite seriously. To me, books are not just entertainment or just Mandarin formal experiments. They're really this quite serious attempt to break the frozen sea within us and to have this really quite essential kind of communication between people. And so much of my impulse as a writer and reader and here a kind of theorist is to try to argue for works that do exactly that. And I don't know how many of you are writing students or aspiring writers, but I guess the thing I'd leave you with a bit is this idea of trying to find a form that releases your best intelligence. That I was writing fiction, I was writing it relatively well, but there was something about the form that I think was not releasing my best intelligence. And for whatever reason, I sort of crab walk sideways toward the sort of literary nonfiction, toward the lyric essay. And I found a form that I think allows me to express my best and deepest and I hope most interesting self. So for any of you in the creative arts, whether painting or music or writing or whatever, I think I would just urge you to be as assiduous as possible in trying to find a form in which you can express your deepest self. So on that note, I shall stop, and if you have questions, comments, disagreements, please speak up.
Very happy to be here, and thanks for coming out on this chilly evening. I happen to know that many of you have horrible colds because I met you earlier today. And I may join you. So I do write very long stories, and this one may be even longer than it is. I am going to read you the beginning of it, bits of the middle, and the end. So you'll have to sort of imagine really what the story is. I'm kind of making a fake story out of it. And even though I'm beginning at the beginning, I'll tell you, tell me if I'm like buzzing or sounding odd or something. I think I'll give you some of the general information just to get you situated in it. The protagonist is a man named Otto. He's a successful lawyer, maybe just about around 60 years old. He lives in a very nice city, in a very nice apartment. He has some upstairs neighbors, Naomi and Margaret. You're going to have to remember this later. Except I'll remind you, Naomi and Margaret, and they've just gone to China to adopt a baby. And Otto is a very, very irritable person at the best of times, but he's in a particularly horrible mood right now. So the title of the story is Some Other Better Otto. I don't know why I committed us to any of those things, Otto said. I'd much prefer to be working or reading, and you'll want all the time you can get this week to practice. It's fine with me, William said, and we'll survive the evening with your... Otto winced. Well, we will, William said, and don't you want to see Naomi and Margaret and the baby as soon as they get back? Everyone always says, don't you want to see the baby? Don't you want to see the baby? But if I did want to see a fat, bald, confused person, obviously I'd have only to look in the mirror. I was reading a remarkable article in the paper this morning about holiday depression, William said. Should I clip it for you? The statistics were amazing. The statistics cannot have been amazing, the article cannot have been remarkable, and I am not depressed. I just happen to be bored sick by these inane, waving our little antennae, joining our little paws to, what is the point? Why did I agree to any of this? Well, William said, I mean, this is what we do. So I'm going to skip ahead to a flashback, and this is really why Otto's in such a terrible mood. He's gotten a phone call from his sister, Corinne, who's trying to get him to come to a family Thanksgiving party. So I'm going to pick up in the middle of that phone call. And this is Corinne. Oh, Otto, I just feel sad sometimes, to tell you the truth, don't you? It's all going so fast. I'd like to see everybody in the same room once a century or so. I want to see everybody well and happy. I mean, you and Martin and Sharon were my brothers and sister. What was that all about? Don't you remember playing together all the time? I just remember Martin throwing up all the time. You'll be nice to him, won't you, Otto? He's still very sensitive. He won't want to talk about the lawsuit. Have you spoken to Sharon? Well, that's something I wanted to talk to you about, actually. I'm afraid I might have offended her. I stressed the fact that it was only to be us this year. No aunts or uncles, no cousins, no friends, just us. And husbands or wives, husband and wife or whatever, and children, naturally. But she became very hostile. Assuming William to be whatever, Otto said, why shouldn't Sharon bring a friend if she wants to? William is family. And surely you remember when she brought that person to Christmas, the person with the feet? I wish you'd go by and talk to her in the next few days. She seems to listen to you. Otto fished up a magazine from the floor, one of the popular science magazines William always left lying around, and idly opened it. Wesley and I reach out to her, Corinne was saying. And so does Martin. But she doesn't respond. I know it can be hard for her to be with people, but we're not people, we're family. I'm sure she understands that, Corinne. I hope you do too, Otto. How clearly Otto could see through the phone line this little sister of his, in her 50s now, the 6-year-old's expression of aggrieved anxiety long etched decisively on her face. In any case, she said, I've called. And yet, there was something to what Corinne had said. They had been one another's environs as children. They'd been born into the arid clutter of one another's behavior, good and bad, their measles, skinned knees, report cards, a barren landscape dotted with clutter. Perhaps the life of the last dinosaurs as they ranged, puzzled and sorrowful, across the comet-singed planet was similar to childhood. It hadn't been a happy time, surely, yet one did have an impulse to acknowledge one's antecedents now and again. Hello, that was us. It still is. Goodbye. I don't know, William said. It doesn't seem fair to put any pressure on Sharon. Urging her to go to Corinne's, I'm not really comfortable with that. Ooh, William, phrase, please, jargon. Why is that jargon? Why? How should I know why? Because it is. You can say, I'm uncomfortable about that, or that makes me uncomfortable, but I'm uncomfortable with that is simply jargon. Otto picked up a book sitting next to him on the table and opened it. Relativity for Dummies. Good heavens, he said, snapping the book shut. Obviously, Martin doesn't want to talk about the lawsuit. Why bother to mention that to me? Does she think I'm going to ask Martin whether it's true he's been misrepresenting the value of his client's stock? Am I likely to talk about it? I'm perfectly happy to read about it in the Times every day, like everyone else. You know, William said, we could go away early this year. We could just pick up and leave on Wednesday if you'd like. I would not like. I would like you to play in your concert, as always. William took the book from Otto and held Otto's hands between his own. They're not really so bad, you know, your family, he said. Easy for you to say, Otto said. Not that easy. I'm sorry, Otto said. I know. Just like William to suggest going away early for Otto's sake when he looked forward so much to his concert. The little orchestra played publicly only once a year, the Sunday after Thanksgiving. Otto endured the grating preparatory practicing, not exactly with equanimity, it had to be admitted, but with relative forbearance, just for the pleasure of seeing William's radiant face on the occasion. William in his suit. William fussing over the programs. William busily arranging tickets for friends. Otto's sunny, his patient, his deeply good William. How spectacular William had been the first time Otto brought him to a family event, that gladiatorial Christmas, 30-odd years earlier. How had Otto ever marshaled the nerve to do it? Oh, one could say till one was blue in the face that Christmas was a day like any other. What difference would it make if he and William were to spend that particular day apart, and so on. And yet, so, steeled by new love in giddy defiance, Otto had arrived at the house with William, to all intents and purposes, on his arm. A tidal wave of nervous prurience had practically blown the door out from inside the instant he and William ascended the front step. And all evening, Aunts, uncles, cousins, mother, and siblings had stared at William beadily, as if a little bunny had loped out into a clearing in front of them. William's beauty and the fact that he was scarcely 20 had embarrassed Otto on other occasions, but never so searingly. "How intelligent he is," Otto's relatives kept whispering to one another loudly, meaning apparently it was a marvel he could speak. "So," Corinne had said in a loud and artificially genial tone, as if she were speaking to an armed high school student, "where did you and William meet, Otto?" The table fell silent. Otto looked out at the wolfish ring of faces. "On 3rd Avenue, he said distinctly, and returned to his meal. "Sorry," he said, as he and William climbed into the car afterward. "Sorry to have embarrassed you, sorry to have shocked them. Sorry, 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 but what was I supposed to say? All that interest, the solicitude. The truth is, they've never sanctioned my way of life. Or, alternately, they've always sanctioned it. Oh, what good is it to have a word that means only itself and its opposite?" Driving back to the city, through the assaultively scenic and demographically uniform little towns, they were silent. Otto glanced at William. No glance was returned. Back in the apartment, they sat for a while in the dark. Tears stung Otto's eyes and nose. He would miss William terribly. "It was a mistake," he said. William gestured absently. "Well, we had to do it sooner or later." "We? We did?" It was as if snow had begun to fall in the apartment, a gentle, chiming, twinkling snow, and sitting there looking at one another silently, it became apparent that what each was facing was his future. Now, I'm going to skip way ahead. Otto and William do pay a visit to Sharon, Otto's sister, to try to get her to this family Thanksgiving party. And I'm not going to read any of the scene with her, but this is, Otto is, they're sitting there with her, and Otto is thinking about her. Her professors were astonished by her leaps of thought, by the finesse and elegance of her insights. She had arrived at hypotheses by sheer intuition and with what eventually one of her mentors described as an almost alarming speed. She was like a dancer, he said, out in the cosmos, springing weightlessly from star to star. Drones, merely brilliant, crawled along behind with laborious proofs that supported her assertions. A tremendous capacity for metaphor, Otto assumed it was, a tremendous sensitivity to the deep structures of the universe. He himself was so literal-minded he couldn't understand the simplest scientific or mathematical formulations. Plain old electricity, for example, with its amps and volts and charges and conductivity. Metaphors, presumably. Metaphors to describe some ectoplasmic tiger in the walls, just spoiling to shoot through the wires the instant the cage door was opened and out into the bulb. And molecules, what on earth were people talking about? If the table was actually just a bunch of swarming motes bound to one another by nothing more than some amicable commonality of form, then why didn't your teacup go crashing through it? But from the time she was tiny, Sharon seemed to be in kindly, light-hearted communion with the occult substances that lay far within and far beyond the human body. The only truly pleasurable moments at the family dinner table were those rare occasions when Sharon would talk. Otto remembered one evening, she would have been in grade school, pink barrettes held back her hair. She was speaking of holes in space. Holes in nothing. No, not in nothing, Sharon explained patiently. In space. And the others, older and larger, laid down their speared meat and listened, uncomprehending and entranced, as though to distant, wordless singing. Perhaps, Otto sometimes consoled himself, they could be forgiven for failing to identify the beginnings. How could the rest of them, with their ordinary intellects, have followed Sharon's rapid and arcane speculations, her penetrating apperceptions, closely enough to identify with any certainty the odd associations and disjunctures that seemed to be showing up in her conversation? In any case, at a certain point, as she wandered out among the galaxies, among the whirling particles and ineffable numbers, something leaked in her mind, smudging the text of the cosmos, and she was lost. When their taxi approached the hotel on that first occasion, Sharon was dank and electric with terror. Her skin looked like wet plaster. Otto felt like an assassin as he led her in, and then she was ushered away somewhere. The others joined him in the waiting room, and after several hours had the opportunity to browbeat various doctors into a hangdog temporizing. Many people got better, didn't they? Had only one episode, didn't they? Led fully functioning lives. Why wouldn't Sharon be part of that statistic? She, who was so able, so lively, so sweet, so, in a word, healthy. When would she be all right? That depended on what they meant by all right, one of the doctors replied. We mean by all right what you mean by all right, you squirrely bastard, Wesley had shouted, empurpling. Martin paced, sizzling and clicking through his teeth, while Otto sat with his head in his hands. But the fateful, brutal, meaningless diagnosis had already been handed down. So Otto and William finish up their visit with Sharon. She seems to be in pretty good shape. She's not having any kind of delusional experiences. She refuses quite sensibly to go to the Thanksgiving party. And Otto and William leave together. So this is them in a taxi later. And William is talking. I've sometimes, and they've talked at this sort of get-together with, they've talked about all kinds of things, including the nature of time. It's one of the things they've talked about. I've sometimes wondered if it might not be possible, in theory, to remember something that the aspect of yourself that you're aware of, haven't experienced yet, William said later. I mean, we don't really know whether time is linear, so would you stop that, Otto said. You're not insane. I'm merely speaking theoretically. Well, don't. And your memory has nothing to do with whether time is really, whatever you mean by that, linear. It's plenty linear for us. Cradle to grave, over the hill. It's a one-way street, my dear. My hair is not sometimes there and sometimes not there. We're not getting any younger. And William, I wish you'd get back to your tennis. That's a bore, William said. Besides, you didn't want me playing with Jason, as I remember. Well, I was out of my mind, and at this point, it's your arteries I worry about. You know, William said, he put his graceful hand on Otto's arm, I don't think she's any more unhappy than the rest of us, really, most of the time. That smile, I mean, that smile can't come out of nowhere. So lots and lots of things happen in this story, and I'm going to skip them now and pick up after the sort of awful Thanksgiving party, as you can imagine, is totally horrible. And again, Otto and William are in a taxi leaving. You're right, as always, Otto said in the taxi later. They're no worse than anyone else's. They're all awful. I really don't see the point in it. Just think. Garden, 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 garden. 2 happy people, and it could have gone on forever. They knew. They'd been told, but they ate it anyway. And from there on out, family. Shame, fear, jobs, mortality, envy, murder. Well, William said brightly, and sex. There's that, Otto conceded. In fact, William said, you could look at both family and mortality simply as byproducts of sexual reproduction. I don't really see the point of sexual reproduction either, Otto said. I wouldn't stoop to it. Actually, that's very interesting, you know, William said. They think that the purpose of sexual reproduction is to purge the genome of harmful mutations. Of course, they also seem to think it isn't working. Then why not scrap it, Otto said. Why not let us divide again, like our dignified and immortal ancestor, the amoeba? Well, William said, I suppose sexual reproduction is fairly entrenched by now. People aren't going to give it up without a struggle. And besides, family confers certain advantages as a social unit, doesn't it? No. What advantages? Oh, rudimentary education, protection. Besides, William pointed out, it's broadening. You meet people in your family you'd never happen to run into otherwise. So, they keep talking about sort of big questions of this sort, and Otto is, the more he sort of thinks and talks with William, the more distressed he's becoming about Sharon. And he's now alone, and he's just thinking. When one contemplated Sharon, when one contemplated one's own apparently pointless, utterly trivial being, the questions hung all around one as urgent as knives at the throat. But the instant one tried to grasp one of them and turn it to one's own purpose and pierce through the mark, it became as blunt and useless as a piece of cardboard. All one could dredge up were platitudes. One comes into the world alone, snore, snore. One, snore, snore, departs the world alone. What would William have to say? Well, it was a wonderful thing to live with an inquiring and mentally active person. No one could quarrel with that. William was immaculate in his intentions, unflagging in his efforts. But what drove one simply insane was the vagueness, or really the banality. Not that it was William's job to explicate the foggy assumptions of one's culture, but one's own ineptitude was galling enough. One hardly needed to consult a vacuity expert. And Otto is getting more and more exercised and distressed as he thinks. And as he's sitting there alone thinking about these things, the phone rings. And it's a sort of official from a hospital calling to say that Sharon has been picked up in some kind of episode. And she's been brought to the hospital. Obviously, she's sort of flipped out. So Otto goes to the hospital to pick her up. The doctor to whom Otto was eventually conducted through the elderly bowels of the hospital looked like an epic hero, shining, arrogant, supple. "She'll be fine now," he said. "You'll be fine now, won't you?" Sharon's smile, the sudden birth of a little son, and the doctor's own brilliant smile met and ignited for an instant. Otto felt as though a missile had exploded in his chest. "Don't try biting any of those guys from the city again," the doctor said, giving Sharon's childishly rounded, childishly humble shoulder a companionable pat. "They're poisonous." "Bite them," Otto exclaimed, admiration leaping up in him like a dog at a chain-link fence, on the other side of which a team of uniformed men rushed at his defenseless sister with clubs. "I did?" Sharon cast a repentant, sidelong glance at the doctor. The doctor shrugged and flipped back his blue-black hair, dislodging sparkles of handsomeness. The file certainly painted an unflattering portrait of your behavior, menaced dentally, it says, or something of the sort. Now, listen, take care of yourself, follow Dr. Shiga's instructions, because I don't want to be seeing you around here, okay? He and Sharon looked at each other for a moment, then traded a little, level, intimate smile. "It's okay with me," she said. There was a bottle of wine breathing on the table, and William had managed to maneuver dinner out of the mysterious little containers and the limp bits of organic matter from the fridge. "Bad?" he asked. "Fairly," Otto said. "Want to tell me?" William said. Otto gestured impatiently. "Oh, what's the point?" "Okay," William said. "Mustard with that? It's good." "I can't stand it that she has to live like this," Otto said. William shook his head. "Everyone is so alone," he said. Otto yelped. "What?" William said. "What did I do?" "Nothing," Otto said. He stood, trying to control his trembling. "I'm going to my study. You go on upstairs when you get tired." "Otto, just please." So eventually, William goes upstairs. Otto sits up all night long, thinking about Sharon and life. And here he is, sitting in the chair during the night. Well, if time was the multiplicity Sharon and William seemed to believe it was, maybe it contained multiple Sharons, perhaps some existing in happier conditions before the tracks diverged, one set leading up into the stars, the other down, to the hospital. Otto's mind wandered here and there amid the dimensions, catching glimpses of her skirt, her hair, her hand, as she slipped through the mirrors. Did things have to proceed for each of the Sharons in just exactly the same way? Did each one grieve for the Olympian destiny that ought to have been hers? Did each grieve for an ordinary life, a life full of ordinary pleasures and troubles, children, jobs, lovers? Everyone is so alone. For this, all the precious Sharons had to flounder through their loops and tucks of eternity. For this, the shutters were drawn on their aerial and light-filled minds. Each and every Sharon thrashing through the razor-edged days only to be absorbed by this spongy platitude. Everyone is so alone. Great God, how could it be endured? All the Sharons forever and ever, discarded in a phrase. So morning comes, and I'm sure that you remember the upstairs neighbors, Naomi and Margaret. They have come back from China with the baby they've adopted, and they brought the baby downstairs to meet Otto and William. And they're sitting there talking, and I'm going to pick up in the middle of that conversation and just take you to the end of the story here. Margaret rolled a little white quilt out on the rug. Plunked down on it, the baby sat, wobbling, with an expression of surprise. "Look at her," William said. "Here's hoping," Margaret said, raising her glass. So, Otto thought, marvelous. Humans were born, they lived, they glued themselves together in little clumps, and then they died. It was no more, as William had once cheerfully explained, than a way for genes to perpetuate themselves. The selfish gene, he'd said, quoting, probably detrimentally, someone, "You were put on Earth to fight for your DNA." Let the organisms chat, let them talk. Their voices were as empty as the tinklings of a player piano. Let the organisms talk about this and that. It was what, as William had so trenchantly pointed out, this particular carbon-based life form did, just as its cousin, according to William, the roundworm, romped ecstatically beneath the surface of the planet. Otto tried to intercept the baby's glossy, blurry stare. The baby was actually attractive for a baby and not bald at all, as it happened. Hello, Otto thought to it. Let's you and I communicate in some manner far superior to the verbal one. The baby ignored him. Whatever she was making of the blanket, the table legs, the shod sets of feet, she wasn't about to let on to Otto. Well, see if he cared. William was looking at him. So what was he supposed to do? Oh, all right, he'd contribute, despite his current clarity of mind. And how was China, he asked. Was the food as bad as they say? Naomi looked at him blankly. Well, I don't know, actually, she said. Honey, how was the food? The food, Margaret said. Not memorable, apparently. The things people have to do in order to have children, Otto said. I've just never envied it. I've just never envied the capacity. Others are awestruck, not I. I've never even remotely wished I were able to give birth. And in fact, I've never wanted a baby. Of course, it's inhuman not to want one, but I'm just not human. I'm not a human being. William is a human being. Maybe William wanted a baby. I never thought to ask. Was that what you were trying to tell me the other day, William? Were you trying to tell me I've ruined your life? Did you want a baby? Have I ruined your life? Well, it's too bad. I'm sorry. I was too selfish ever to ask if you wanted one, and I'm too selfish to want one myself. I'm more selfish than my own genes. I'm not fighting for my DNA, I'm fighting against it. I'm happy as I am, William said. He sat, his arms wrapped tightly around himself, looking at the floor. Who needs more champagne? You see, Otto said into the tundra of silence William left behind him as he retreated into the kitchen. I really am a monster. But Margaret sat back, contemplating something that seemed to be hanging a few feet under the ceiling. Oh, I don't know, she said. I suppose you could say it's human to want a child, in the sense that it's biologically mandated, but I mean, you could say that, or you could say it's simply unimaginative, or you could say it's unselfish, or you could say it's selfish, or you could just say, well, I want one. But when you get right down to it, really, one what? Because actually, I mean, well, look at Molly. I mean, actually, they're awfully specific. I abase myself, Otto told William as they washed and dried the champagne glasses. I don't need to tell you how deeply I'll regret having embarrassed you in front of Naomi and Margaret, how deeply I'll regret having been insufficiently mawkish about the miracle of life. I don't need to tell you how ashamed I'll feel the minute I calm down, how deeply I'll regret having trampled your life, and how deeply I'll regret being what I am. Well, that last part I regret already. I profoundly regret every tiny crumb of myself. I don't need to go into it all once again, I'm sure. Just send back the form, pertinent boxes checked. I intend to accept your forthcoming apology for... Please stop, William said. Oh, how awful to have ruined the life of such a marvelous man, Otto said. Have I ruined your life? You can tell me, we're friends. Otto, I'm going upstairs now. I didn't sleep well last night, and I'm tired. Yes, go upstairs. Good night, William said. Yes, go to sleep, why not? Oh, it was like trying to pick a fight with a dog toy. Just you go on off to sleep. Otto, listen to me. My concert is tomorrow. I want to be able to play adequately. I don't know why you're unhappy. You do interesting work. You're admired. We live in a wonderful place. We have wonderful friends. We have everything we need and most of the things we want. We have excellent lives by anyone's standard. I'm happy, and I wish you were. I know that you've been upset these last few days. I asked if you wanted to talk, and you said you didn't. Now you do. But this happens to be the one night of the year when I most need my sleep. Can it wait till tomorrow? I'm very tired, and you're obviously very tired as well. Try and get some sleep, please. Try and get some sleep. Try and get some sleep. This is unbearable. I've spent the best years of my life with a man who doesn't know how to use the word and. And is not part of the infinitive. And means in addition to. It's not try and get some sleep. It's try to get some sleep. Two. Please try to get some sleep. Otto sat down heavily at the kitchen table and began to sob. How arbitrary it all was and cruel. This identity, that identity, Otto, William, Molly, the doctor. Sharon would be up now, sitting at her own kitchen table, the white enamel table with a cup of tea, thinking about something, about numbers streaming past in stately sequences, about remote astral pageants. The doctor had rested his hand kindly on her shoulder, and what she must have felt then. Oh, to convert that weight of the world's of the world's compassion into something worthwhile. The taste, if only she could have lifted his hand and kissed it, the living satin feel of his skin. Everyone had to put things aside for good. The way they had smiled at one another, she and that doctor. What can you do, their smiles had said. The handsome doctor in his handsome doctor's suit, and Sharon in her disheveled lunatic suit. What a charade. In this life, Sharon's little spark of consciousness would be costumed inescapably as a waif at the margins of mental organization, and the doctor's would be costumed inescapably as a flashing exemplar of supreme competence. In this life, and frankly, there would be no other, the hospital was where they would meet. Otto? A hand was resting on Otto's shoulder. William, Otto said. It was William. They were in the clean, dim kitchen. The full moon had risen high over the neighbors' buildings, where the lights were almost all out. Had he been asleep? He blinked up at William, whose face, shadowed against the night sky, was as inflected, as ample in mystery as the face in the moon. It's late, my darling, Otto said. I'm tired. What are we doing down here? That's the end. Thank you, thank you.